The alarm didn't sound like an alarm should sound. It sounded like the universe deciding it was time to collect an ancient debt. Commander PULSAR was reviewing the spectral scan logs when the propulsion panel flashed red so abruptly that for a moment he thought it was a malfunction in his own visual sensors. The Sylvans had learned over millennia of evolution not to rely on emotions to interpret data, but there was a primal biological response that not even the most rigorous discipline could completely eliminate: the recognition that something was very irrevocably wrong. "Report," he said, and his voice came out with the usual precision of one who had trained for 42 cycles not to let any inflection escape without purpose. Engineer Silra turned from the power station with wide eyes, which for a Sylvan was equivalent to what humans would call genuine terror. "The radiation pocket we passed through in the last 14 hours left an ionized trace inside the core compartment. The crystal matrix is in progressive collapse. Commander, I don't have a computable solution." The last 4 words hung in the recycled air of the ship like a gravitational anomaly. In PULSAR's entire career, no Sylvan engineer had ever uttered that sentence. It was equivalent to a confession of catastrophic systemic failure. "Time until total collapse?" asked Navigator Tinvo, already hovering his long bluish fingers over the trajectory panel, calculating emergency routes in real time with the processing speed that made the Sylvans so extraordinarily efficient in the mathematical vacuum of space. 18 to 22 minutes with a 3% margin of error," Silra replied. "There are no spare parts for a collapse of this magnitude. The crystals form a quantum resonance pattern that cannot be reconstructed without a Class Omega precision fabrication chamber." Medic Fental arrived from the aft corridor, having sensed the variation in the ship's acoustic pressure, which for the Sylvans was as legible as a clinical report. He assessed the situation in 2 seconds and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the data hadn't already said. PULSAR stood for exactly 4 seconds. There was an internal Sylvan process called pragmatic reassessment, a state of forced cognitive clarity where all emotionally inconvenient variables were removed from the equation, and what remained was only the most efficient path. He activated it now. "Location check," he said. "Sector 7 Gamma, Outer Arms Subregion," Tinvo replied. "The nearest trade route is 46 light days away. Communications operate at 7% capacity after damage to the relay amplifiers. A distress signal, even on the standard emergency frequency, would take between 120 and 180 days to be detected by any registered receiver. With error margins added to the deep space attenuation factor, the probability of a response before life support depletion is calculated at 0.04%. Fental approached unbidden. "Life support gives us 4.5 operational days after engine collapse. With extreme rationing, perhaps 6. PULSAR processed. His civilization's High Council operated on principles he himself had championed throughout his career. Resource allocation was always guided by the probability of return. Sending a rescue vessel to such remote coordinates for a crew of 4 researchers in a sector where Sylvan presence was considered of low strategic value would be classified as irrational. He knew this because it was precisely the kind of decision he himself would have made from the other side of the equation. The irony was clinically interesting. He noted it and filed it away. "There is an alternative," he said. "The emergency stasis pods have independent power autonomy for an estimated period of 6 to 8 months. If we transmit the continuous distress signal on the obsolete long-range frequency and enter stasis before total life support depletion, we keep open a minimal, but not null, probabilistic window. The difference between 0.04 and 0. Something, Tinvo said, and there was a tone in his voice that in any other species would be recognized as bitterness. It's a choice between dying with certainty and dying with statistical dignity. It's a choice between 0 and any number greater than 0, PULSAR corrected. The Sylvans do not refuse equations simply because the results are uncomfortable. There was a human expression PULSAR knew only from translation records, collected during the few observation missions his civilization had conducted in the galaxy's more populated sectors, a glimmer of hope. The expression had always seemed imprecise, sentimental, and therefore of little analytical value. Now, for the first time in 42 cycles of life, he understood what it tried to capture. It wasn't hope. It was the mathematical refusal to accept zero as a final answer as long as there was at least one different path available. While Silra and Tinvo prepared the stasis pods, the ship passed through an asteroid field that none of their damaged sensors had detected in sufficient advance. 3 minor impacts compromised the external supply compartments and cracked the aft shielding of the communications module. The distress signal, already weak, grew even weaker. Fental recorded his farewell message to his family with the economy of words that characterized the Sylvans. Relevant facts, biographical data, disposition of material assets. A single phrase of affection at the end that sounded, even in his own voice, like something learned rather than felt. He paused the recording for a moment, then added a second phrase he hadn't planned. He didn't know why. He filed the anomaly for later analysis, if there was a later. PULSAR was the last to enter the pod. Before lying down on the cold surface of the cryogenic compartment, he looked out the emergency room's single window. Space was what it had always been, immense, indifferent, and perfectly logical in its hostility. There was nothing out there that cared about 4 Sylvans lost at irrelevant coordinates. He closed his eyes. The pod's systems began the cooling protocol. Somewhere behind him, the ship's crystal core finally collapsed in silence, and the gray star, which had been their home for the last 18 months of the mission, became a cold metal husk drifting aimlessly through a sector no one cared to map. The distress signal pulsed, weak, irregular, but present. 60 days later, 63 light-years away, on the bridge of the UES Challenger, Captain Dr. Eleanor Vance was having her third breakfast when the navigation computer emitted a beep she hadn't heard in 14 years of exploration service. She slowly put down her mug, tilted her head, and said, "Repeat that." The computer repeated. Eleanor stared at the coordinates for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to Chief Engineer Marcus Webb, who was calibrating mineral density sensors 6 feet away from her, and said the phrase he most dreaded hearing during a mission with a tight schedule and a deadline-attached delivery bonus. "Marcus, we're going to have to make a detour." Marcus Webb had the face of a man who had spent the last decade smiling at impossible problems until they gave up. It was a broad, dark-skinned face, marked by a cluster of wrinkles around his eyes that Dr. Redmond called laugh lines and Marcus himself called evidence of poorly paid work. He was the best systems engineer Eleanor had ever seen in the field, and she had seen him solve 3 critical emergencies in the last 2 years using nothing but basic tools, enviable creativity, and a life philosophy he summarized as, "It works until proven otherwise." When she said they needed to make a detour, he was already getting up from his chair. "How far?" he asked. 42 hours of standard propulsion," Eleanor said. "Perhaps a little more because we'll have to reduce speed so as not to damage the tow probe when docking." "And what's there?" "An emergency signal on an obsolete frequency, like very obsolete, cataloged as Galactic Distress Standard Class 7, which was retired as an active protocol about 80 years ago because no registered civilization still used that band." Marcus was quiet for a second. "No registered civilization?" "Exactly. The UES Challenger was a medium-sized mineral exploration vessel registered under contract with the Helian Resources Corporation, and technically, Eleanor had no authority to deviate from the mission without approval from the project manager, who was 46 communication days away and who, she knew from experience, would respond to the detour request with a sequence of forms that would take longer to fill out than the rescue itself. She made the decision without sending the form. This was, strictly speaking, a violation of Article 14 of the operational contract. She had violated Article 14 twice before in her life, and both times she had been right. She decided this would be the third. "Sienna!" she called out to Lieutenant Sienna Park, who piloted with the serene precision of one born understanding ballistic trajectories as a second language. "New navigation vector. I'm sending the coordinates now." The Challenger's crew was small, like all exploration crews. Besides Eleanor, Marcus, and Sienna, there was Dr. George Redmond, ship's medic and xenobiologist, and systems specialist Kira Osi, the youngest of them all, who had joined the Space Navy 6 months earlier with a high-precision systems engineering degree and the conviction that the universe was a physics problem awaiting an elegant solution. Sienna and Kira were the ones who most doubted the detour. Not openly, because Eleanor wasn't the type of captain who created space for disguised opposition, but there was a certain tension in both their shoulders that she recognized as unverbalized professional concern. "Speaking is more efficient than staying quiet with a look of miscalculation," Eleanor told Sienna once the trajectory was plotted. Sienna gave a half smile. "I'm just thinking about the report. The report will be much more interesting after we save someone, or it will be much longer if we find nothing." "That's also possible," Eleanor agreed. "But we haven't found anything in the last 18 hours of mineral scanning anyway, so at least this would be an interesting non-discovery." 41 hours later, the Challenger reduced its approach speed, and long-range sensors confirmed what the signal promised. There was a ship there, motionless, with no heat emission, no active containment field. A dead ship. But there was a ship. "I've never seen this hull pattern," Kira said, studying the readings with the intensity of someone seeing something for the first time and trying to file away every detail. "Titanium alloy with an inclusion of a metal not in my database. Non-human hull geometry. It's not Calori, it's not Sindath, it's not Architect, it's something else." "Do we have life aboard?" Eleanor asked. "Weak biological signatures, very weak, but present. 4 of them in different compartments." Kira looked up. "They're in stasis, Captain." "How much power do the pods have?" "Hard to say with the reading I'm getting. Could be days, could be weeks. I wouldn't risk more than that." Eleanor turned to Marcus. "We're going to need EVA suits and adaptive cutting equipment. Docking will be manual." "I expected as much," Marcus said, and he was smiling in a way that George Redmond, observing from the medical station, mentally classified as insane in the best sense of the term. The boarding operation took 3 hours and 40 minutes. The temperature inside the unknown vessel was 4 degrees above freezing. The atmosphere was rarefied but technically breathable with filter support. Marcus and Kira cut through the hull at 2 points, using tools adapted on the fly because the alien ship's access pattern didn't match any known galactic emergency protocol, another sign that the civilization that had built that ship lived far beyond the limits of the commercial map. The 4 stasis pods were in a room that had clearly been designed to be found. There were indicator panels in a language no one aboard the Challenger understood, but the power and biosignal indicators were universal enough for Kira to interpret safely. 2 pulses per second, constant temperature, stable cryofluid flow, she said. "They're alive, all 4 of them." George Redmond knelt beside the first pod, running a shipboard scanner along the transparent lid material. "Unusual morphology. Blue-silver skin, dense bone structure, long fingers, very long. Body proportions of someone adapted to gravity, greater than standard terrestrial." He paused. "I've never seen anything like this. And look." He pointed to the figure's hands inside the pod, crossed over its chest with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial. "This position. It's not natural rest. It's deliberate. They positioned themselves like this before entering stasis. Like who? Marcus asked. Like someone who spent their entire life controlling every detail of their own body, George said, and who wanted to ensure that, even unconscious, they conveyed composure. Eleanor observed everything in silence for a moment. Then, let's take them to the medical bay. Carefully, very carefully. She looked at the 4 pods as if reading something written between them. These aren't lost explorers. These are scientists from a civilization the entire galaxy doesn't yet know, and they chose to rely on silence and an obsolete frequency instead of waiting for a rescue they knew wouldn't come. That tells me something about who they are. What does it tell you? Sienna asked. Eleanor took one of the handles of the first pod. That they are pragmatic to the core, and that when they wake up and discover they were saved by strangers for no apparent logical reason, it will be one of the biggest cognitive crises they've ever had. Marcus let out a deep laugh. Welcome to humanity, friends. The transport to the Challenger's medical bay was executed with a precision that would have pleased even the Sylvans, though they didn't know it yet. The 4 pods were connected to the human ship's power system, which George adapted in real time with a series of modified connectors that would make any precision engineer wince, and which, as Marcus pointed out with satisfaction, worked perfectly. The pods began the gradual warming protocol. The biological signatures grew stronger. Eleanor remained in the medical bay, sitting in a chair she had pulled up next to the pods, with the coffee mug in her hand that she had forgotten to drink. She looked at the 4 motionless faces behind the transparent material, each with that expression of serenity that seemed less rest and more discipline frozen in time. They'll have a lot of questions when they wake up, George said, checking the monitors beside her. Undoubtedly, Eleanor said. Any idea how we'll explain why we came all this way? She took a sip of cold coffee. I'll tell them the truth. We heard the signal. We came to see. Simple as that. George looked at her. Do you think simple as that will satisfy whoever these individuals are? Eleanor observed the 4 motionless figures for another moment. There was something in their faces, even completely static, that conveyed a quality she could only describe as calculated expectation, as if, even in cryogenic sleep, part of them was already processing probabilities. No, she said, it won't satisfy them, and I think that's going to be the most interesting part of this whole story. On the other side of the transparent material, Vielsor was slowly returning from the silence where he had left his body, and the first coherent thought he formed, even before opening his eyes, was the same one that had been his last thought before falling asleep. The probability was 0.04%, and yet, the first sense to return was hearing, and the first sound Vielsor registered was something he couldn't immediately classify. It was a voice, but there was a rhythmic irregularity to it, an inflection pattern that rose and fell in ways that didn't seem to carry coded data. It was as if the being was emitting sound frequencies without clear communicative purpose. Then he understood. The being was singing, softly to itself, without audience, without protocol, for no apparent reason beyond. Existing sonorously in space, the idea was strange enough to complete Vielsor's waking process better than any biochemical stimulant. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was metallic gray, utilitarian, with exposed conduits running in parallel with reasonable efficiency, but no design elegance. There was instrumentation along the walls that he recognized as medical in nature, though the models and protocols were completely foreign. There were smells his olfactory system couldn't catalog, one of them intense and slightly bitter, present on all surfaces as if it were part of the ship's atmosphere. The figure that was singing turned when he moved. It was a young male of the unknown species, light reddish-brown skin, Dark, short hair, eyes that registered Vielzor's presence with an expression the commander took a moment to decode as genuine scientific enthusiasm. The figure held a monitoring device in one hand and in the other a cylindrical container from which vapor rose and that bitter smell emanated. "Ah, you're awake," said the figure in a language Vielzor didn't know, but which the emergency translation module implanted in his auditory process picked up and processed with an acceptable 72% accuracy. Slowly, slowly. You've been in stasis for 61 days. The body needs time. Time. Vielzor processed. 61 days. The signal had worked. The probabilities had manifested on the correct side of the equation. "Where are the other members of my crew?" he said, and his translation module automatically converted to the being's language, which according to his records was called English, a regional language of a species called Homo sapiens, inhabitant of a planet called Earth, which Vielzor had catalogued as species of secondary interest in a galactic observation report he had written 3 cycles earlier. He would remember that report with some discomfort in the following weeks. "Your companions woke up in the last 2 hours," said the human, whose uniform identification read, Dr. George Redmond. "They're in separate compartments with members of my crew, all stable, all coping well with the environment." There was a hesitation before "coping well" that the translation module registered as a possible euphemism. Vielzor sat up carefully. His body was functional. The pod's maintenance systems had operated correctly. He assessed the environment with the same analytical sequence he used to evaluate any new territory: immediate threats, available exits, capabilities of those present. He found 0 immediate threats, 3 visible exits, and a being who was clearly more interested in studying him than in harming him. "You are this ship's medic," Vielzor said. It was not a question. "I am. Dr. George Redmond, ship's medicine and xenobiology." George placed the steaming container on a nearby surface with the ease of one carrying it as an extension of his own arm. "And you are?" "Vielzor, research commander of the Gray Star vessel, affiliated with the Institute of Outer Sector Exploration of the Sylvan Confederation." He paused. "This is the first time my civilization has had contact with yours under direct communication conditions." George opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "First time. Direct contact." He took a deep breath. "I needed to have the recorder on for that sentence." "You possess no records of our civilization?" "None. You are the first evidence we have that the Sylvans exist." George picked up the steaming container again and took a sip with the naturalness of a completely automated reflex. "And by the technology standard of your ship, we estimate you are at least 200 to 300 years ahead of us in development." Vielzor observed the container. "What is that substance?" "This?" George looked at the mug as if he had forgotten he was holding it. "Coffee. Hab is basically an infusion of roasted plant beans. It has caffeine, which is a neural stimulant. We consume it in industrial quantities." "What is the caffeine concentration per unit volume?" George thought for a second. "Depends on the preparation. An espresso has between 50 and 80 milligrams per 30 milliliters, more or less." Vielzor internally consulted the biochemical database he had access to. It took less than a second to cross-reference the described composition with its effects on species with organic-based nervous systems. His eyes, already expressive by Sylvan standards, widened slightly. "You consume this voluntarily? Regularly?" "Several times a day. In concentrations that would be lethal to at least 12 species cataloged in the average galactic registry." George stopped drinking. He looked at his mug. He looked at Vielzor. "Seriously? The caffeine dosage equivalent to what you have consumed since I entered this compartment would be sufficient to induce cardiac fibrillation in a healthy adult calori." There was a silence. "Huh," George said. And then, as if this were simply another interesting data point in a universe full of interesting data points, he took another sip. But it works well in humans. It's part of our biochemistry. You have developed a tolerance to a neurotoxin and made it a central part of your culture. That's one way to look at it. George smiled in a way Valsor was still developing analytical vocabulary to describe. It was a smile that held no defensiveness, no aggression, no subtext of social dominance. It was simply the smile of someone who had just gained a new data point about himself and found it genuinely amusing. May I ask you something, Commander? Proceed. How can you distinguish when I'm lying or being sincere? I mean, humans use facial expression and intonation a lot to communicate that, and I'm wondering if your translation module picks up on those layers. Valsor considered the question, which was more sophisticated than he expected. Partially. Intonation is cataloged. Facial expression is variable. But there are inconsistencies in your communication that pure logic resolves. For example, if you had hostile intentions, you would not have awakened me in an open environment. If your species were predatory in social nature, you would not have diverted your mission to rescue unknowns without formal galactic obligation protocol. So you have already assessed that we are safe. I am in a process of continuous evaluation, Valsor said, but the current data is favorable. George nodded with that warm naturalness Valsor was beginning to recognize as a standard characteristic of the species. May I take you to see your companions? And then, if you feel up to it, the captain would like to speak with you. The captain is the one who made the decision to divert the mission to respond to the signal. Yes. I want to understand your decision-making logic, Valsor said, standing up completely for the first time. His height was noticeably greater than George's, and he had to adjust his posture to avoid colliding with the ceiling conduits. In our protocol, diverting a mission to respond to a signal of unknown origin without guaranteed calculable return would be classified as a Grade 3 judgment error. In our protocol, too, George said cheerfully, heading for the exit. But Eleanor has a consistent track record of Grade 3 judgment errors that always work out. Valsor followed the medic down the corridor. The ship was smaller than the Gray Star, denser with that quality of intensely inhabited space that the Sylvans, with their expansive and impeccably organized research stations, avoided on principle. There were photographs affixed to the walls. There were personal objects visible through the open portals of the rest compartments. There were signs of wear on surfaces that on any Sylvan ship would have been replaced at the first sign of abrasion, and there were, at least 4 different points in the corridor, containers identical to George's, with that same bitter smell lingering in the recycled air. Valsor passed the second container and observed a new crew member pick it up without looking, drink while studying a control panel, and set it back down without diverting attention from the screen. The movement was so automatic it bordered on reflex, a species that had developed metabolic and cultural dependence on a neurotoxin and had centralized it to such an extent in their daily routine that consumption had become involuntary like breathing. That had built social rituals around it. That consumed it under conditions that would be clinically dangerous for most life forms Valsor knew. And that had diverted a corporate mission, risking contractual penalties and delivery schedules, to investigate an obsolete emergency signal of unknown origin at coordinates off any relevant route. He filed both observations under the same category: humanity. Unpredictable with insufficient data. Requires expanded analysis. Sil-Ra had spent the first 4 hours after waking in a state that, in any other Sylvan, would be diagnosed as severe cognitive dissonance. In herself, she classified it as environment-forced priority recalibration, which sounded more efficient but essentially described the same thing. The problem was the human engineer. Marcus Webb was, by Sil-Ra's objective criteria, a walking contradiction. His system configuration logs were impeccable when she consulted the computer. His structural failure diagnoses were swift and accurate. He understood propulsion physics with a depth she didn't expect to find on a mining vessel. And at the same time, he kept doing things that in any Sylvan engineering context would be grounds for immediate disciplinary intervention, like what he was doing now. "You are talking to the ship," Silra said, from the position where she observed. With her arms crossed in the body configuration, humans seemed to interpret as defensive, but which among the Sylvans was simply a posture of neutral analysis. "I am," Marcus said, without taking his eyes off the auxiliary propulsion panel he had partially disassembled. Parts were scattered on a workbench with a degree of organization Silra took a moment to recognize as intentional, but unconventional. The parts were grouped not by type or size, as was standard protocol, but by some other criterion she had not yet deduced. It's just that the Challenger has a different vibration when the auxiliary cooling system is overloaded, like a hum in G minor. When I hear that, I know I need to check the pressure valve before the monitor registers it. "You diagnose engineering problems by sound frequency, sometimes also by smell. A field coil burnout has a specific scent you recognize after the second time." He picked up an improbable-looking tool, which seemed to be composed of at least 3 different tools fused together. "This here is my universal detector. It's never let me down." Silra studied the object. "That's a calori precision tool modified with a human-fitting adapter and what appears to be part of a basic scanner circuit." "Exactly. The calori adapter can reach internal spaces that standard human tools can't access. The basic scanner tells me the part's temperature without needing to touch it, and the original calori tool has that grip that balances perfectly for my hand size." He turned the object naturally. "It works better than anything on the approved equipment list. You created an uncertified instrument for use in critical propulsion systems." "I created an instrument that works for the specific problems I face in my specific job," Marcus said. And in that sentence, there was something Silra recognized as an entire philosophy embedded in casual syntax. Certification is for those who do the same things under the same conditions always. In deep space, conditions change. Silra was silent for a moment. In Sylvan civilization, precision engineering was as much a cultural pillar as a technical discipline. Perfection was not just practical, it was aesthetic. A Sylvan vessel was a work of synthesis between function and form elevated to the highest possible standard, and an engineer who deviated from specification without formal authorization would be violating something much closer to a moral imperative than an administrative norm. What made Marcus Webb unsettling was not his competence. It was the ease with which he transitioned between absolute rigor and creative improvisation, treating both as equivalent tools to be chosen as context demanded. "May I see the Greystar's system logs?" he asked, as he reassembled the auxiliary panel with movements that were simultaneously quick and careful. Specifically, the records of the crystal matrix collapse. Silra considered. There were protocols for sharing technical information between species that she was technically violating by simply being on this ship without council authorization. But the council was months of communication distance away, and she was alive, which was a prerequisite for any protocol violation worth considering. "I can share the collapse parameters without the proprietary architecture data." "Perfect." He opened a screen panel and she transferred the logs via her emergency communication module. Marcus studied them for 2 minutes, completely motionless. With that concentration, she was learning to recognize as the way humans processed complex information, very different from the linear speed of the Sylvans, but with a different, more lateral quality, as if he were building connections between things that logically shouldn't connect. "Interesting," he finally said. "The crystal core fragments that are still in your ship, do they retain any remnant resonance?" "Theoretically, yes, for a period of 90 to 120 days after collapse. After that, the resonance dissipates completely, and the crystals become mere inert matter." "How long since the collapse?" 61 days of stasis plus approximately 4 days of operation prior to collapse. 65 days. Marcus tapped his fingers on the workbench at a rhythm Silra recognized as the human equivalent of parallel processing mode. So we still have resonance in the fragments. Listen, I have a crazy idea. Define crazy in the context of propulsion engineering. It means it will work, but for reasons I'll have difficulty explaining in a standard technical report. He turned completely to her. The crystals collapsed because the quantum resonance pattern was compromised by radiation, right? And to function correctly, they need a perfect symmetrical pattern. But what if you don't try to reconstruct the perfect pattern? What if you use the fragments as they are, asymmetrical, and create a new pattern that is consistent within the asymmetry? Silra opened her mouth to reply that it was physically impossible, and then stopped. Because technically, it was merely unprecedented. There was no fundamental law prohibiting an asymmetrical resonance pattern from generating propulsion. There was only the fact that no Sylvan engineer had tried, because an asymmetrical pattern would produce significantly lower efficiency and frequency instability that any quality controller would reject before approval. Efficiency would be critical, she said slowly. Propulsion would be unpredictable in duration and stable only within limited ranges. But it would be propulsion, Marcus said. Enough to reach the nearest frontier station, which is exactly where we need to get anyway. You are proposing that we build an engine that functions incorrectly but sufficiently. I am proposing that we build an engine that works. Sufficient is a consequence. He smiled. And it was that smile Silra was beginning to classify as the human facial expression for, I know this is absurd and I'm going to try it anyway. In human engineering, there's an unofficial principle we call a jury rig. There's no direct translation, but it's basically an improvised solution that meets the objective without meeting formal specifications. The perfect jury rig is one that works well enough to solve the present problem without creating new ones. Silra was silent for a long moment. She was processing not only the technical feasibility, which was improbable but not impossible, but what the proposal revealed about the civilization that generated it. The Sylvans had achieved their technical standing because they never accepted imperfect solutions. But humans had reached this deep space sector with technology that was objectively inferior in several parameters, because they accepted imperfect solutions when that was all they had. And she was alive because a weak signal on an obsolete frequency had reached a human ship that had deviated from its route without guaranteed calculable return. The universe, she was beginning to suspect, didn't care much for specifications. I'll need access to the Gray Star's propulsion compartment, she said. And I'll need your modified tools. Sylvan tools were designed to work with symmetrical patterns and will create resistance to what we're trying to do. Marcus picked up the improvised tool from the workbench and handed it to Silra. She held it carefully, assessing its weight, center of gravity, the reach of each component. This is, she began. Horrendous by most design standards, Marcus agreed. I was going to say functional, Silra said. At that moment, from the corridor, came the voices of Commander Valesor and Dr. Redmond, and from the fragment of conversation that reached her, Silra concluded that her commander was doing exactly the same thing as she was, trying to understand humans with the analytical tools they had, and discovering, one observation at a time, that the tools needed to be expanded. The Sylvan engineer looked at the human engineer who was cheerfully explaining how he intended to use quantum science and creative improvisation to resurrect an engine with destroyed crystals, and made a decision she mentally registered as protocol deviation, justified by exceptional circumstances. Then she considered that perhaps she needed a broader category, because for the first time in her career, she had the feeling that exceptional circumstances were the default state of any sufficiently large universe. Show me the calculations, she said. And for the first time since she had woken up on this strange ship, with its marked walls and corridors smelling of cultural neurotoxin, Silra felt something that took a moment to identify as genuine curiosity rather than professional analysis. It was a small distinction, but it was there. Eleanor Vance had learned, over the course of 14 years of space exploration, that the most dangerous moment of any mission wasn't the crisis itself. It was the period immediately after the crisis had passed, when the adrenaline subsided and people began to think about what had really happened. That was when judgment errors materialized, when decisions made in the heat of the moment converted into formal reports, and when leaders who had done the right thing for the wrong reason collapsed, trying to retrospectively justify what instinct had decided at the time. She didn't have that problem, because she had made peace with Article 14 a long time ago. But the one sitting on the opposite side of the table in the Challenger's small command room clearly did. Vielsor had arrived at the meeting with the precision of one who had prepared for it. Upright posture, neutral expression, hands resting on the table surface with long fingers completely motionless. The translation module he used was from his ship, an implant that processed languages in real time with a quality that genuinely impressed Eleanor, and the speed with which he had acquired fluency in English over the 8 hours since waking suggested linguistic learning capabilities she didn't even want to imagine. "I want to understand your decision structure," he said, without preamble, directly to the point, as she expected. "You diverted your ship's mission in response to a signal of unknown origin on an obsolete frequency at coordinates outside any route of strategic value. You had no information about the nature of the signal, about the species or species that generated it, about the resources the rescue would require, or about the return it would produce. You simply diverted." "That is an accurate description, yes," Eleanor said. "What was the logic?" Eleanor held her coffee mug for a moment, thinking about the best way to respond, not because she was looking for a justification, but because she was genuinely trying to translate something that for her existed as feeling before logic. "There's a very old story in my culture," she said, "about a being who walked along a beach after a tide had thrown thousands of starfish out of the water. The being began returning the starfish to the sea, one by one. An observer stopped and said, 'It's no use. There are thousands. You can't make a difference.' And the being picked up another starfish, threw it back into the sea, and said, 'It made a difference to that one.'" Vielsor remained completely motionless for a second. It was the kind of stillness Eleanor had already learned to recognize as intensive processing. "That is a moral tale," he said. "It is. That uses emotional logic to justify behavior that ignores scale analysis. That too. And you based an operational mission deviation decision on that." "Not exactly," Eleanor said. "I based it on something simpler. There was a signal. The signal asked for help. I had the capacity to respond. In any universe where those three conditions are simultaneously true, you respond. The rest is bureaucracy." Vielsor inhaled in a way that Eleanor's behavioral analysis module registered as paradox processing. But the probability of a successful rescue without any prior information was extremely low. It was also much higher than 0. There was a silence. Eleanor recognized that she had just used Vielsor's own argument back on him, the reasoning that had kept him on the distress signal instead of simply letting the ship drift. She hadn't known this when she spoke, but by the way his eyes reacted slightly, he perceived it. "There's something I need to ask," Vielsor said, and there was a different quality in his voice now, more cautious, as if he were navigating territory he had mapped, but for which he still lacked fully reliable instrumentation. "Ask," Eleanor said. "Your High Council, do they know you are here?" "They will know when I send the report." "And the mission protocol violation?" "They will include it in a performance review." Eleanor shrugged slightly. "I've had worse reviews." "You do not fear the consequences?" "I do. Eleanor said, "but there are things I fear more than consequences. One of them is becoming the kind of person who ignores a distress signal because protocol didn't authorize a response." Vielsor was silent for a moment that stretched to the point where Eleanor was beginning to wonder if she had said something that the translation module had rendered incorrectly. Then he said, "In our civilization, there is a concept called pragmatic reassessment. It is the process of removing all emotionally inconvenient variables from a decision to identify the most efficient path." A pause. "I spent my entire career believing that this was the superior way to make decisions." "And now," Eleanor said, "now I am considering that perhaps what the Sylvans call emotionally inconvenient variables are, in fact, variables that our efficiency models simply do not know how to quantify correctly." Another pause, longer. "You saved 4 lives that my own High Council would have dismissed as statistically unrecoverable. This suggests that your decision model accesses something that mine fails to calculate." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Want to know what else complicates this whole conversation? Tell me." "I can't fully explain why I did what I did in a way that would satisfy an auditing committee. I can try, but it will sound exactly as it is. A decision made based on something I call instinct, and which is probably just decades of experience compressed into a reflex that fires faster than conscious analysis can." "Instinct," Vielsor repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "Humans have a lot of that. We make bad decisions because of it all the time. But sometimes," she lightly raised her mug, "sometimes it hits the mark." From the corridor came Marcus's voice, who had spent the last 5 hours on the Gray Star with Silra, working on what he had described to Eleanor as the most insanely fun project he had ever touched. The door was partially open, and the words reached them. "It's working, it's really working. Look at the resonance frequency." Vielsor turned his head towards the voice. "They are testing the engine prototype," he said. "It seems so. Silra communicated the proposal to me this morning. Considering the instability parameters involved and the absence of certification for any component of the hybrid system." He paused. "But," Eleanor said, "but the basic logic of asymmetrical resonance is sound. I reviewed the calculations. It should be impossible, and technically it is not." "That sentence pretty much sums up humans in general," Eleanor said. A new signal from the corridor, the voice of Navigator Tinvo, who had spent the last hours in tense but increasingly collaborative debate with Sienna Park about navigation routes and the difference between computational calculation and pilot intuition. The tension had progressively decreased as Sienna demonstrated, maneuver after maneuver in simulation, that what she called instinct was actually a decision pattern that incorporated flight experience data no algorithm had been trained to replicate. "Your crew," Vielsor said, "is teaching my crew things that never appeared in any Sylvan training manual." "Yours is teaching ours back," Eleanor said. "Kira spent 3 hours with your medic learning about cellular accelerators. She said it's the most elegant thing she's ever seen in field medicine." "Elegance is a central value in our culture. In ours, too. We just get there by more circuitous routes," Eleanor said. And then, because there was something that had bothered her from the beginning and which she had decided it was time to ask. "May I ask a direct question? I am learning that it is your standard mode of communication," Vielsor said, and there was something she was beginning to recognize as the Sylvan equivalent of dry humor. "When you entered the stasis pod, did you believe someone would appear?" The question hung in the air for a long time. Longer than any previous pause in the conversation. "No," Vielsor finally said. "I calculated the probabilities and concluded that the pod was the choice of least resource waste in a situation where all other options led to the same outcome. I entered stasis because it was the most efficient thing to do, not because I expected to be saved. And yet you transmitted the signal. It was standard emergency protocol. But you transmitted on an obsolete frequency." Silence. The primary frequency was damaged, he said. The obsolete frequency was the only one available. Right, Eleanor said, and she didn't press further because there was a difference between asking the right question and insisting on the answer you wanted. But she saw in his eyes, in those almost metallic blue irises, that he too was asking himself the same question, and that the answer he found was not entirely comfortable for someone who had spent his entire life believing that emotions were variables to be eliminated. There was a human expression for that too. Something Eleanor's grandmother called nameless hope. The will to transmit the signal even when you didn't believe anyone would hear. It was, Eleanor thought, perhaps the most fundamentally human thing of all. And apparently, it wasn't exclusively human. Korvath 7 Station was the kind of place the galaxy created in its less organized corners, an accidental metropolis, built in layers by decades of unplanned expansion, where each civilization that had passed through had left a floor, a wing, a structure coupled to what was there before. It was noisy, densely inhabited by at least 17 registered and some unregistered species, and absolutely alive in the way only places without central design can be. The Challenger docked at Platform 7 with the Gray Star towed alongside, its improvised engine having delivered exactly what Marcus had promised. Propulsion unsatisfactory by any formal engineer's standards, yet completely sufficient to cover the 18-day journey to the station. Sil-Ra had monitored the system every 4 hours throughout the trip, and had recorded an amount of data on asymmetrical resonance behavior that, she had told Vaelsor with unusual seriousness, could represent a new field of research for the Sylvans. A field of research that exists because a human engineer suggested we try something impossible, Vaelsor had replied. Technically not impossible, Sil-Ra had corrected, and there was a different quality in her voice that Vaelsor recognized as incorporated learning. The last week had been intense in the way only the forced proximity of very different people could generate. Teenvo and Sienna Park had developed a hybrid navigation system that combined Sylvan computational processing with human intuitive mapping, producing routes that were simultaneously more efficient and more flexible than either approach alone. They hadn't become friends in the human sense of the term, but there was a mutual respect so dense between them that Vaelsor had observed it as positive data several times in recent days. Fental and George Redmond had created something that could only be described as a genuine scientific collaboration, comparing the medical systems of the two civilizations with the enthusiasm of two researchers who discovered that the problems each had solved were exactly the problems the other still faced. George had called it evolutionary complementarity. Fental had called it unexpectedly valuable data, and it had sounded, to those who knew him well, like the same thing expressed differently. Vaelsor had spent much of this last week in conversations with Eleanor that began as interrogations and ended as something he was having difficulty classifying. They weren't just exchanges of information. There was an element of mutual exploration that the data he possessed about interspecies interaction did not adequately predict. There were moments when he said something that she received with that smile, not the polished smile of diplomatic protocol, but the smile of someone who had just found confirmation of something they already suspected. And there were moments when she said something that made him pause and recalculate. Not because it was wrong, but because it opened a perspective his analytical models had not considered. It was, he had concluded with some effort, what humans called a real conversation. Now they were on Korvath 7 Station's docking platform, with the characteristic noise of a galactic frontier station around them, overlapping languages, smells of multiple cuisines, and different life systems. The persistent scent of metal and fuel that permeated all spacefaring locales frequented by species still reliant on physical propulsion. And there was coffee. Naturally, there was coffee. There was a human establishment visible less than 50 meters from the docking platform, with a sign that even without translation was recognizable by the universal symbol humans had managed to establish in all inhabited sectors, the silhouette of a steaming cup. PULSAR observed this fact with what he had learned to recognize as internal humor. "So," Eleanor said, standing beside him with the slightly uncomfortable formality of someone who doesn't quite know the farewell protocol for an unprecedented situation, "has your people's ship been contacted?" "The High Council received our message 3 days ago. A rescue vessel is en route. It will arrive in approximately 12 days. And the report? The report will be long," PULSAR said, "and it will include a section on humanity that I'm not sure how the Council will receive." "In what sense?" He considered for a moment. There were more efficient ways to say what he wanted to say, but he had learned in recent weeks that the highest efficiency wasn't always what communicated the most. "My civilization spent centuries building the belief that the universe was a problem to be solved with sufficient precision," he said. "That failures were errors to be eliminated, that emotion was noise to be filtered, and that a technically advanced enough species had little to learn from those who had not reached the same level." A pause. "In 12 days of coexistence, I was forced to revise all these premises." Eleanor was silent for a moment. "We learned things too." "Yes, but you already knew you didn't know everything. We didn't know we didn't know." There was a significant difference between these two conditions, and Eleanor recognized it. "What will you recommend?" "To the Council. I will recommend formal contact, exchange of scientific information. And I will recommend that we include in the training curriculum of all Sylvan researchers a concept I learned from this crew." He paused. "The concept that sometimes the most efficient solution is the one that works, not the one that is perfect." Silra was a few feet behind next to Marcus, who was enthusiastically gesticulating about something she identified by context as a proposal for an engineering collaboration. She was responding with her arms crossed in the posture of neutral analysis, but there was something different about her. Her head was slightly tilted, which for the Sylvans was a sign of active engagement, not passive evaluation. Marcus, Silra had concluded, was the most irritating being she had ever known and also the most instructive, and these two qualities were, she was discovering, often connected. Tinvo and Sienna were further ahead, consulting something on a portable panel that they both held at the same time, and there was an efficiency in that shared gesture, in that physically divided space without discomfort. That would have been unimaginable 2 weeks prior. Fental had found the station's medical clinic and was inside with George, discussing protocol integration with the local medic, with the seriousness of a researcher who had finally found the right library. Kira Osi was sitting on an equipment crate near the entrance, writing in a physical notepad, which Eleanor considered one of her most endearing and most inefficient habits. A manual translation of the Sylvan communication crystal that PULSAR had shown her that morning. "There's something I want to give you before you leave," Eleanor said, and took a small object from an inner pocket. It was a miniature blue ceramic coffee mug, with the UES Challenger emblem engraved on the side. A memento, of the kind that existed in all human spaces, without technical value and with a value of another kind that resisted quantification. PULSAR received it with both hands, as he had observed to be the human gesture of respectful reception. He examined it for a moment with the total attention he gave to all data. "It is a decorative object with no practical function," he said. "It's a memento," Eleanor said. "Among humans, physical objects carry the weight of memories. It's one of our ways of not letting important experiences get lost in time." PULSAR looked at the mug for a long moment. Then he stored it in his personal equipment compartment, with more care than any technical instrument on his ship had received. In return, he disconnected a small crystalline rod from his communication module that pulsed with a soft blue-silver light that seemed to breathe. "This is a fragment from the Gray Star's core. One of those Silra used to build the hybrid engine. It still has remnant resonance. If you place it near any long-range communication receiver in the next 20 days, it will emit our identification frequency. One day, when formal contact is established, it might be useful. And if formal contact takes longer than 20 days? Then it is just crystal, PULSAR said. But it will have been part of something that worked. Eleanor closed her fingers around the fragment. It was warm, which she hadn't expected. Warm like something alive. In the station square in the background, a child of a species none of them recognized was chasing a delivery drone with a laugh that effortlessly crossed any translation barrier. The child couldn't reach the drone. It didn't stop trying. PULSAR observed for a moment. She won't succeed. Probably not, Eleanor agreed, and keeps trying. It's what we do. There was something in that sentence that wasn't just about that child, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The farewell was brief, as goodbyes between people who know they will meet again tend to be, less sentiment in the departure, because there is an expectation of return. PULSAR inclined his head in the sylvan gesture of formal recognition between equals, which was, as Eleanor had learned, a gesture reserved only for those who had demonstrated real merit by their standards. Eleanor extended her hand in the human gesture of a handshake, and he reciprocated with that careful familiarity of someone who had learned the meaning of the gesture and wanted to get it right. As the Sylvan crew departed towards the station's temporary lodging sector, Eleanor stood on the platform for a moment longer than necessary. The crystal fragment was warm in her hand. Beside her, Marcus appeared with 2 mugs of coffee, as he always did when he sensed she needed a moment but wouldn't ask. "So?" he said. "So," she repeated. She took a sip of coffee. "I think the universe got a little smaller today. There are more people in it than there were yesterday. That's what makes it smaller," she said, "and larger at the same time." Marcus considered that. "Deep for the level of caffeine you've already consumed today." Marcus: "Yes? Thank you. For the engine. For everything." He gave that smile, the "it works until proven otherwise" one, and drank his coffee. It's what we do. And that was exactly it. It was what humanity did, had done, and would continue to do in the darkest and coldest corners of the void. It transmitted signals without certainty they would be heard, responded to signals without certainty of what it would find, fixed what seemed too broken to be fixed, and moved forward not because it was sure it would work out, but because the alternative was to stand still. It wasn't efficiency. It was something better. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew has inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier, because the universe is vast, dangerous, and full of stories waiting to be found by those brave enough to deviate from the course.